weeks ago, a piece came out, 2 weeks ago today, in the New Yorker, where Gar reveals a story that he'd not even talked to Mark and Dick about. This is ridiculous. He'd only talked to Sharon about. So and that has 7 seconds in the movie The Post, but that is a real tale of courage at that moment that IPS was also involved in, as Michael has said. So I asked Gar if he would just say a word about this and remind us also about Dick and Mark.
What John really said now, you should tell the young people the story. And some of us, so people know the story of the Pentagon Papers. And what they were 7,000 pages that Dan Ellsberg had copied at the Rand Corporation of a study done by McNamara, which showed basically that at every stage of the game, the people who made the decisions both knew it could not work, sending more troops, and lied to the American people about it. That's what the Pentagon Papers showed inside the government, and that's what McNamara knew, and that's what Dan, who was working at the Rand Corporation, knew. Now, 3 million people died in the Vietnam War. 3 million people, 58,000 Americans. So the moral importance of somehow getting this story out was extraordinarily significant. So Dan Ellsberg was working at Rand, and he copied the papers and was looking for a way to get them out. And it came first to IPS. And maybe you had a chunk of the papers, but 7,000 pages, probably there were other pieces.
No, we only had, in the beginning, a few hundred.
A few hundred pages. But Mark and Dick somehow got them, and I think Ralph Stavens, if he's here, got them into the hands of Neil Sheehan, the New York Times reporter. That's the first part of the story. And then there were still many hundred pages, thousands of pages left, and Dan had them copied in Cambridge, where I was with Sandy Jenks, who was trying to start a spin-off of IPS called the Cambridge Institute. So we can make this a long story, but I'll try to make it very short. Dan desperately wanted to get this story out. People were dying, and the draft was on, so there was an extremely intense anti-war period. Later on, the government decided to get rid of the draft because then college students wouldn't protest, and that's what they did. And so they take poor people now to fight the wars. But Dan had these papers and wanted to get them out after. How do you do that? And his idea, and I just met Dan, I think Mark set this up. Mark was I was very close to Mark from the beginning. And Mark had Dan invite me to dinner. And so I had dinner with Dan and his wife, and another woman was there. And I think Mark was trying to make the connection, but he never said that, never acknowledged that. But they wanted to put the papers out when they'd been stopped. And they needed some help. So I helped them. And I became something called, quote, Mr. Boston was my pseudonym. And the problem was that Dan, I'm not going to do it more too long, but Dan wanted to dump all these 7,000 pages because he urgently wanted to get the story in the front pages. And so I convinced him that if you broke this up, maybe people could digest pieces of this story rather than the 7,000 pages. And more important than that, maybe we could keep the story going for 3 or 4 weeks. So every time they shut down one newspaper, we went to another newspaper. And then they shut that one down. 23 newspapers. So every day there was a story in the national press because a piece of the story was brought out. And I played a role in doing that. So that's the Pentagon Papers story. Although looking back on it, I'm amazed. I mean, I didn't think this is weird. I didn't think of it as terribly risky. I knew it was risky. It probably was very risky. But people were doing things, but a lot of people were dying, and so a lot of people were taking risks that they felt it was important to do, including putting stuff in your fireplace, things like that. So that's the story.
And thank you.
The short version.
Thank you. No, and just in the spirit of intergenerational learning, I'm just, it is.
It's young guy.
Yeah, sort of in the middle of this. Now, is that the more we've heard the stories, Frank's stories from that early period of SNCC, and Dick and Mark and Gar and others with the Pentagon Papers, and even Mark and Dick, in their late 20s and 30, leaving, solid jobs in the White House to come and start something that you have to raise money for somehow. And it's a great deal of courage, and there are equivalents of this throughout the next decades, and many of the people in the room have been part of those, but it is part of the history of IPS that you all should feel very proud of and keep talking about and writing about. I mean, I am stunned that Gar and Mark, who had dinner, whatever, never told each other about this. So I want to just urge you all to tell these stories now. Tell them in this case to a fantastic reporter at the New Yorker who got the whole thing down. But share. And Frank, I do want people to go. If you haven't been to the African American Civil War Museum, Frank has done an amazing job with that. But his early days here as well.
And the risks that SNCC took.
And the risks that SNCC took, yeah. And now we are 50 years later celebrating. Pushing for a new Poor People's Campaign. So thank you. So we don't want to make this all super formal. We're going to show you this little clip of Mark, including a little bit of that piano thing that he did, and then we can make it more informal again. But please, do stay and do tour and do get, for those of you who are coming back, re-engage by talking to Shorab and Emily and Michelle, Boss out and Sarah and so on. We love that. Go ahead, Justin.
In the life.
You probably could have been in Carnegie Hall.
What was it like to work with Mark Raskin? Well, certainly never born.
He is always at the center of the debate and the center of the dialogue.
He's always been an activist and a scholar combined.
He not only listens, but there's a sense of Mark as a latter-day Socrates.
He taught me to take history seriously, especially U.S. history, which I have never taken very seriously.
The struggle for justice is one of endurance, stamina, and walking on the shoulders of those who preceded you.
I took over from Mark and Bob's office, and so I said, Mark, what do you do? How do you be a legislative assistant? And he said, what do you mean? You figure out all the things you want to do, and then you make the congressman do it. We always teased Mark. He went into the White House, and almost immediately thereafter, the Bay of Pigs happened. The timing of the events was such that Mark, without even knowing it, was part of the administration that started that. And I think it was a jolt to him to realize where he was and what he was trying to do.
That was a bold move. They had to worry about whether they were going to get a budget that would sustain them. And in those days, the progressive think tanks were not in great number.
Arthur.
When my dad first became involved with the Institute of Policy Studies, Mark Raskin and Dick Barnett became household words, except the word was Mark and Dick, as in, Mark and Dick did this and that the other day, or that's a hell of a Mark and Dick kind of an idea.
The Institute had some very rough days, and the most extraordinary was the bombing which killed Orlando Letelier and Carpen Moffat. It was a shock to realize that the politics that people were involved with was not a game. Connie was Mark's assistant. When her name comes up, you can see the mist cloud over his eyes.
bond. We can't do that. It's too big. It would cost too much. But fortunately, over the years, IPS has been smart enough to pursue several of these big ideas of Mark, and they worked, and the world's a better place because of it.
There's nobody who is not an exile. There is no place to run. There is only the possibility of expression of what it is to be a human being. What you have to do is do it with a community. And that community can be here in the city, it can be internationally. The work of the Institute, in this sense, I think, under the leadership of the people to my right, reflect that sentiment, and so they are carrying a very great tradition, and I hope that all of you will be part of that tradition. Thank you.
Weeks ago.